Welcome everybody to another VITA Learning webinar. Today we have Dr. Javier Vasquez. Hi, Dr. Vasquez. How are you doing today?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here. Everything excellent. Looking forward for today.
You look like you got a very busy office or lab. Lots of stuff going on, milling. You've got photography going on. You got a lot of different monitors.
We have everything ready for a good patient experience every time.
All right, that's good to hear. Got to think about the patient. That's important. Sometimes we forget about that. So today, Dr. Vasquez, we're going to go over the workflow in creating natural anterior aesthetics using internal and external techniques. Before we get going, just a couple housekeeping items. Those of you that are attending, your phone is on mute. So on the right-hand side of your panel, if you have a question, go ahead and submit that question through that panel. And then the question and answer session will be held at the end of the program. The workshop, the webinar itself, will be recorded, and give us a couple days and we'll post it on our learning websites, whether it's a VITA North America YouTube channel or our education channel. But come visit those. We will have plenty of recorded webinars and videos on those sites. So today we are happy and good to see Dr. Vasquez providing us with some good educational information for what he does in his clinic with the materials that he's chosen to use. So let me introduce Dr. Vasquez. He's obtained his doctorate in dental medicine, a degree at the Metropolitan University in 1997. He's completed training in the areas of aesthetics and restorative dentistry, orthopedics, cranial cervical dysfunction, and TMJ. He obtained a fellowship in Fukuoka, I know I didn't pronounce that correct, but out of Japan, and has a mastership in the USA from the International College of Craniomandibular Orthopedics. Dr. Vasquez is a current clinical adjunct faculty member at the Dental College of Augusta University, the prosthodontist program. He is one of the early adopters in CAD-CAM evolution. For over 17 plus years, in the last 6 years, has been an active developer into the integration, interdisciplinary treatment using 3D data integration. For the past 5 years, he's united with a company called Nemotech, a company in Madrid, Spain, in developing a computer software that integrates a platform for interdisciplinary treatment planning. He is a member of the world-renowned organization Oral Design, founded by master ceramist Mr. Willie Geller. He's the owner and clinical director of Miami Natural Smiles by Oral Design Dental Clinic, where together with his amazing clinical team of doctors and auxiliaries, developed the most comprehensive and high-end aesthetic cases, implementing the most advanced technology, science, and dental art. He also owns Oral Design Miami, dental laboratory studio focusing on high aesthetics and function. And as a dentist and master ceramist, being a passionate educational leader, clinical consultant, and international speaker in the areas of occlusion, cranial cervical dysfunction, high-end aesthetics, he provides insight on how to handle real-life patient situations found in dentistry. He lives by his motto, "The limit is the sky. To dream, to learn, and to do, I live life." So, Dr. Vasquez, thank you for joining us today and providing us with, an hour of your time and providing some very much needed education to the dental world from your perspective. So, thank you very much. And I will now make you the presenter. And we will bring up Dr. Vasquez's screen and what he's going to show today. There we are.
Okay. Perfect. So thank you, Jim,
right.
for this great introduction. We will take pretty much of the time for the workshop this with the description, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you guys to be here to give me the pleasure to be talking for you guys, sharing a little bit about my passion for dentistry, the passion for artistry, and the concept that I call CAD-Artistry, that is a combination between what technology can do these days and what is the base foundation that is the artistry in nature. Thank you, VITA, to create these amazing events to be able to educate people. I love education more than anything else, and I believe that is not what you learn, it's what you share. And that's what I try to put some information that I think can be valuable for some dentists that can be connected and the technician also that they be connected. I'm gonna go over some topics that they relate, basically the concepts of how to create anterior aesthetics utilizing internal and external techniques by any meaning, from internal characterization with internal stains plus combination of cementation techniques to be able to achieve and modify the chroma or the intensity of the restorations. That is more focused to the clinical side, but still the dental technicians need to know what happened into the chair to be able to manipulate and make the proper choice of the materials to make beautiful restorations. So first of all, the concept of CAD artistry is something that I've been talking about 17 years because I was one of the early adopters, as Jim say, in CAD-CAM technology, involved with Sirona for 17 years and had the opportunity to be one of the people that orientate the people to understand how technology can get to a highest level. And 17 years ago, 15 years ago, these people doesn't believe in technology, in CAD-CAM, and technically we were judged to be bad quality restorative. And that was my mission, to try to show that the combination, the aesthetics and the technology can be create the best marriage to have a great success and be more efficient in the workflows and protocols that we work chairside, but also into the laboratory side. But it's impossible to understand what really happened or how we're going to treat a patient or how we're going to do a restoration if we don't really understand nature. And in nature, we need to be aware that we're replacing layers that they have a special structure that create specific effects that we try to mimic through the restorations that we do. That can be handmade, it can be computer made, but at the end, we depended on manufacturers that how is the internal structure of that tooth and how is the projection of those enamel rods that it creates such an amazing effects of absorption, reflection, and create effects of light dynamics. That's what it makes nature pretty much difficult to emulate. And when we see this, for instance, this photo for one of my friends, Sasha Hain, for oral design as well, what we can show with this photography, what is the characteristic of the dental dentition? How amazing was God in the architecture of the internal structures of the tooth, having areas of biggest opacity, some areas of bigger fluorescency, some areas of more translucency, and the combination of all these layers that three-dimensionally create effects to be able to play with light dynamics to be able to create an effect that is really, really hard to emulate. So when we see this is where the challenge really starts. This is what we're trying to mimic. And if we see all those internal characterizations, they play a big role in how definitely we need to choose the material to make restorations. This picture shows the same tooth under different light conditions and under the influence of black and white that allows to see some intensities in chroma, some values, and how the architectural structure is going on inside and externally for the tooth. Because most of the color is coming from the inside out and not sometimes how we do it from the outside in when we make stains. And that's why we really need to understand the techniques that we're going to use and the material that is going to be the foundation, the core, the structure, that need to have some specific properties to be able to don't be saturated too much with the stains techniques, because every time that we add in stains, we are adding layers of dirt. Technically, we're killing eventually the translucency of the material because the amount of particles that they put. And that's why we have different techniques that we will touch bases today about what is going to be the best combination of stain materials that we're going to use for every specific restoration. So here we can see all the same tooth, all what the light shows when we have more absorption light, how we can see more polarity, more opalescence into the incisal edges and the line angles. But when we have diffuse light, how we can start to see microstructure and textures that they go more into the superficial layers of enamel. Because we need to understand everything is about absorption and reflection. So if we have an intense light, when we see in a color, we're gonna see that pretty much we're gonna kill the internal characterizations. And that's why when we use indirect lights or bouncing lights, we can be able to see a little deeper into the inner structures of the teeth to try to be able to choose the stains or the proper stratification that we want to do for every particular case. Another really important factor is to be able to understand aging, because I mean, we live in a culture that pretty much we lose in the essence of what nature means. We can notice it every day with the plastic surgery cases that they come in every time more out of proportions, and technically it's creating some contrast that is not aging with the reality of what it really happened with to the patient. So here we can see like 4 different stages of the person. Like we can see every period of 10 years how the color starts changing. And it's a specific reason because that happens, because we have an sclerotic dentin underneath that over trauma or aging is creating that the enamel layers, it became a little more translucency. And with the wear and tear, we open micro windows into the incisal edge that allows some absorption of some stains that it will be pigmentating those internal layers, and it will make some effect a little more visible. Another conditions as parafunction and grinding of the teeth also create an stimulation on the internal fibers of the tooth, the internal cells that is going to create a protection into the sclerotic dentin to try to saturate with a stronger kind of dentin to protect the tooth. As we know, the human body is one of the organs, also one of the systems that has a proper auto protection, and this part of this sclerotic dentin process and the aging into the tooth, into the chromatic layers, it will relate it with some functional events. So that's something to characterize, to have as a condition, and then every time that we're going to make characterizations. If we start paying attention to what we see up into the incisal edges, for instance, we can tell that every single person, it will have totally different characteristics, not only into the shape by itself, because pretty much all the teeth has the tendency in an 80% at least to be kind of symmetric, the teeth form into the right and left. It's just these functional pathways what create some wear and tear and create some beveling or some different effects that create the customization and that perfect genetic patterns. This is what every single tooth technically is going to be like a fingerprint. If we have this own coding and this own description in what happened outside, not only for the color, also for the shape, the form, and the internal characterization, that is what we're trying to achieve every day. All these incisal edges, they show in some ways or another ones, some of them, some refreshed smiles, some younger smiles, and some, it will show more dense sclerotic dentins into that incisal edge or more areas of translucence with the tendency to be a little more fluorescent, and is related because this internal auto stratification that happens by the friction of the teeth and the creation of these sclerotic dentin patterns. So when we try to emulate restorations for years, feldspathic restorations in techniques as refractory and platinum foil has been that alternative that mimic and integrate pretty nicely with the natural dentition. And the fact is that we don't have an internal core. Technically, we build in a structure in the air where we have the capabilities to put these micro layers and microposition of powders with different effects that it will try to create the prismas, reflection, and breakage of the light. And I could tell that feldspathic ceramics, I think, is one of the more natural restorative solutions that you can have. Unfortunately, as we have a strength, sometimes materials that they became so rigid or so strong, they have the tendency to be a little more fragile at the end. And we can see that this restoration in a long term, it can have the tendency to develop some cracks. So here we can see three feldspathic restorations over the platinum foil technique. In these cases, it's not necessary to have a determination of the termination line. Technically, what the gum line is what will create determination. And the capabilities of these ceramics to be thinner out smoothly into the mouth, it allows that we don't gonna have any kind of step, or if we're gonna have it, it's gonna be so minimal. As I explained to me, the maestro Willy Geller, that he has been recognized for this technique of platinum foil. He say, what is the problem is the transition between the root and the crown always is going to have a CJ that is a change into the volume that it will change technically the architecture of the surrounding the tissues. So create another step that doesn't impinge the biological weight can be a great solution to be able to have these restorations. And the feldspathic is a good material, really easy to work after that is cemented, to be able to create restoration that technically they will totally disappear into the contours and into those margins that doesn't exist, but with the more beautiful property that is the absorption of those chromatic layers coming from the natural structure of the knee. Of course, when we talk about minimal invasive dentistry, we need to talk about the substrate, and we need to know what can be possible, what can be the limitations, because we need to understand, as we show in the first pictures, that we have different layers, and the chromatic layers have the tendency to go all the way inside. And technically, the enamels create some filtering that kind of dilute that chromatic layer coming from inside. So when we try to make changes in color being minimal invasive, we have the tendency to lose that depth that the natural tooth is creating by the layering and this complexity of filters that allows the light to be reducing and creating a huge polychromatic effect into the reflection and vitality of the restorations. As we can see in refractory and feldspathic restorations, we can control the chroma and the opacity for internal layers, but again, it will depend technically with the space that we have. So what is becoming the biggest issue today in restorative work is that most of the patients, they want non-invasive cases with dramatic color changes that it will make the technicians and the dentists to decide to use materials that they are a little more opaque. And unfortunately, it creates an effect that lose the luster and the depth that normally natural dentition has. And then when we start with CAD-CAM technology, we need to start looking for solutions, because now we have one of the best resources to be able to integrate efficiency in our workflows into the practice or into the laboratory to be a little more efficient and more systematic, capable to do restorations that they can be more natural if we make the proper choice of the materials that we use. So in order to be able to take advantage of the technology these days, with the materials that we have, that most of them, they have the tendency to be monolithic materials with different translucencies that allow some filtering or special effects that we want. It's important to understand that with this technique that is called ink and glue, created for Ivan Ronal in Brazil, a big mentor, a good friend of mine, who's been teaching me a lot about morphology, and have the opportunity to go to Mexico to get trained in this ink and glue technique that allows that we can thin out restorations in ceramics all the way to 0.1, 0.2 having the capability to bond the restorations to the model, to be able to grind it with some specific burns, depending on the material, understanding the property of the materials and the way that the temperature and the integrity of the margins, it can let us use some special instruments for every single condition that we utilize. As you can see here, since the veneers has been painted inside, you can see that the more intense areas is the areas that technically the color is coming through. And this kind of resemble a little bit about the effect of the feldspathic material, but with some sort of limitations. And that's why when we have 90% of the restoration capable to be restored with these minimal invasive techniques, of course, it's going to be a little percentage that can be utilized manipulating at the cementation point, but also with some characteristics on minimal stain and glaze to make it look natural without blockage in the light, because the effect of the stains, it will have the tendency to create some opacity, even that we create an effect that they try to create translucency. So here we can see over a model that it kind of show a little bit the color of the stumps or the structure underneath, how we can fine tune our micro restorations, how they can become really, really thin, but with the power and capabilities of work with some sort of the silicate material or some combination of these materials that can make it even stronger, having the freedom to be able to make restorations that they can be thinned out to a maximum expression. Of course, we start with the power of CAD-CAM making the design, and then by hand, we're capable to thin it out these restorations to be able to have the effect of contact lenses. This is restorations in enamic, one of my favorite materials. We use it a lot in multiple situations for permanent solutions, but also as a long-term temporarization during the cases that we do orthodontic here in the clinic, because many times patients is coming exclusively thinking for some aesthetics, and during that process of time, we will need to be fixing the bite, because as Jim say, we believe that the human body is not only a teeth, it's a big influence of the systematic approach for the entire body. So most of the cases that we treat, we always changing the bite through orthodontics mostly, and then through some restorative treatments. So here we can see how the restorations has been painted inside, that they can be cemented to the stumps to be able to have a full intimacy between the contact of the restoration and the stump, what it guarantee that it will be stronger and we have less risk of fracture. Technically, this technique emulates what we do in the mouth when we cement those restorations, that we can really abuse them, trying to thin them, make it thinner into the mouth because they're cemented. So I think this is one of the huge inventions of how we can combine CAD-CAM technology with some sort of techniques. But it's really, really important that we need to understand that to be able to reduce the thickness of these restorations, we're totally capable to reproduce morphology and shapes, because the computer gives you amazing designs, but if you want to get to the minimal thickness that we're trying to achieve with this technique, we definitely need to finish all the restorations through hand, and we need to have a proper sequence of how we're gonna keep those contours and shapes that the computer gives us. This particular case, for instance, is a ceramic material. So we have minimal staining, is ceramics, and we did this case in combination between enamic and ceramics into the front. But then when we're going to talk about the color and the shade, we definitely need to be aware that we working in a canvas, because we're not working in refractory materials. So we're not creating a canvas of complexity of powders. We're using a base, and that base need to have some properties, and those properties is the ones that is going to create that inner layer where we're going to carry on the stains or the minimal powders to be able to create micro effects. So we talk about the effect of the luminosity, that is that capability to be translucent, what we call value, and that layer that is the chroma by itself, that is a combination between chroma and hue, what define color. When we talk about value, it's really important to understand that when you have a color that you diluted too much, the particles that create the chromatic layer, they get more apart. What creates an effect of bigger absorption in a state to have been more reflected. So that's why we really need to be aware of what translucency material we're gonna use depending of the restoration that we're gonna do. What is that thickness? We have opacities that resemble mostly dentin layers, that they more opaque and chromatic. And then we have materials more high translucence that reproduce the conditions of the enamel. So it's really important that we understand that the proper choice need to be based into the amount of space that we have for the restorations. And it's really, really important to understand also the limitations of the materials, because eventually we have a tooth that in the facial is really thin, and we have like missing a corner or an interproximal angle. We're gonna have a bigger challenge, because if we use a super high translucent material, the part that is unsupported by the structure, definitely it will create a more layer of absorption, and we're gonna lose the value, and the restoration is gonna be noticeable. So that's one is really, really important to understand this factor. In here, we have a combination of different products, and all these products, they were described as a one chromatic layer following the VITA shade guide. But the composition internally and the proportions that these microparticles are spread into the matrix that has been used to carry on and create the block, it was making that those particles can have the chance to be more dense, more together, and create more reflectiveness into the structure. As you can see here, beta dynamic is one that shows a bigger density into the color, being really natural, and has the tendency to be one of the materials that match more naturally the natural dentition and the colors for the beta shade guide. These days, we have multiple alternatives of systems to create an analysis of the chromatic layers of the tooth to be able to resemble all these intrinsic and extrinsic characterizations of the tooth to be able to choose materials. But remember, when we have one material that is being CAD-CAM, we're going to have to be a little more savvy about what is going to be the material that you're going to use that is going to give you the properties and the effects that you need. Here we can see at the same time how the materials that they became so translucent and the chromatic layer, because the prioritization is create translucent, how we dilute that color and how we start seeing some gradientage effect into the restoration. And that can be acceptable if you're working in a big segment into the mouth, but when you're working by small areas, this became a really difficult case to be able to have restoration that they really have a natural life, and they can technically disappear between the other restorations. When we use cross-polarization allows to be able to see a little deeper internally into those restorations. We can see how some materials, it has more chroma under these techniques, and it will show that in the mouth it's going to have less of this greatest effect. That is one of the things that we don't like, is undesirable, let's say. Now, at the end of the day, we want to have a final color, but that final color is a combination of different elements. We cannot take the entire responsibility of the chromatic matching only working in the superficial layer. This is a combination, this is a teamwork. And to me, being a dentist as a ceramist, I always create value to have more communication between the dentist and the technician, and understand each other's the limitation that each one has in their own field. Because sometimes limitation of a space that a patient wants restorations that they minimally invasive, but sometimes those internal chromatic foundation that is called substrate is not equal or doesn't have the proper balance to create an harmonic restoration. So that's the time when we can have different minor manipulations through cements that we can use to try to create a little more of that bouncing effect of light or that effect of warming that is going to create a better transition between the prosthetic restoration and the natural dentition to make that the restoration disappears. Also, we have the capabilities these days with the materials that we have, with like the accent LS, that we can definitely can mix this with the cements that we use and be able to create extra characterizations for those cements to be able to create some other effects. If the time allows that, I hope it happen, we're gonna be able to show you some samples that I have, but definitely this is my first webinar with VITA, but it's not gonna be the last. Most of the techniques that I'm going to be showing here, they will become independent workshops that we can do hands-on and definitely show step by step what is my thinking process into the concept of anterior aesthetics. Here we can see how a simple change into the value of the trying paste in this case, or in the cement for a final product, we can change the internal brightness of the restorations. But remember, it's only directly related with the thickness of the restorations. We cannot think that having a restoration with a huge amount of preparation, the effect of the cement is going to have any effect into the restoration. And nothing more unlike that trying to have a restoration that is thick, try to use an effect of the really opaque cement, that only the part that is going to be opaque is going to be the margin, that is going to resemble the effect of the PFM and the opaque to trying to blockage in a thinnest amount of space, and that will become really unnatural. So the material choice for cementation is directly related in the material the technician or the CAD-CAM user dentist is choosing to develop the restoration. And then that became that part when we're really going to combine the value of our artistry, when we can really know how we're going to tweak the concept of CAD-CAM technology, taking advantage of form. Because if the color of the material it became a little limited to the effects or internal characterization, always having a good form, it can be a good key for success. We can make a lot of compensations with different effects to try to create the natural effects that we're looking. So this is a workflow that I developed over, let's say, 12 years. I think this was my first CAD-Artistry course that I teach in company with Frank Acosta and Jay Black, that we were talking about the concept of CAD-Artistry. And technically, these were the some of the designs that we were doing back then. I mean, we didn't have the libraries that we have today, but also I think it's really important that every single doctor or technician that is using CAD-CAM has the proper skills and knowledge to understand where nature is coming from. So every time that we have a design, we need to understand what is the line angles where the computer gives us, and if we want to preserve those angulations of those line angles or those effects. Otherwise, we can definitely create some line angle characterization that it will follow the proper optical approach of the position of the roots. It's really important to understand the line angles and the validation of the root position. So sometimes if you don't make the line angles in the proper way, even that you're doing rotation, that is one of my favorite things to do, since I had the luxury to get trained with Willie Geller, and he taught me that symmetry doesn't exist, that is all harmony. And at that point, I start involving my restorations a little more flow into the way that I'm designing and in the way that I'm doing my characterizations, to have every single case to be a little different and has a little bit of that human touch of artistry to try to resemble the effect of nature. So the line angles are really important, that they follow the root shape, and then we start cleaning those line angles until we start delimiting what is the area of the reflection that we want to have. In addition, we need to understand that the tooth has 3 different planes of inclination, that not only for the frontal view, but mostly for the projection view in the sides, we will need to have that like protrusion coming from the gingiva, and that final bent end of inclination into the incisal edge. And we can see with the blue pencil how we delimiting what will be the area of the reflection of the tooth, where we will concentrate it in what is going to be the real color of the restoration. In the other two other parts, we're going to have the capabilities to play with some stains to be able to emulate the natural restorations. So here we can see the three planes into the inclination of the teeth. And for a 12 o'clock view, we can see how the line angles are properly defined and how we're showing little by little what is those effects that we want to create. For the lingual aspect, you notice that the teeth are not symmetric, and we're trying to create some effects to be able to make the restorations to look more alike. So after that, we start working in this area, we're going to start working into the embrasures area, because the embrasures are the reflection of the root shape. Nothing more unesthetic and unpleasant than to have the interproximals of the roots to be convex, because most likely the shapes of the anterior teeth, they have the tendency to be more ovate. I'm sorry. So to be more ovate, it will create some bulkiness that doesn't exist. And that's why the red lines show those areas that they need to be flat or they need to be concave to be able to make a dramatic change into the light behavior to create the effect or the flatness of the root. Here, this is how we're going to start defining different levels in the architecture of the texture that we're going to create for the cases. Technically, this is what we call the anatomy, where we're going to start creating some areas of depressions where the green color is, with the position of the burrs that I showing, that it will create some changes into the behavior of the light and the connections between the root position and how is that transition between the root and the clinical crown of every case. So always we need to keep the axis of the tooth. That is what we want to express into the position when we're making those line angles orientation, but also to validate the texture. That primary texture need to follow the inclination of the roots, and that's why it need to be congruent with those red lines that is showing the axis of the tooth. That is when we're going to create these bigger areas of concavity, when we're going to be a deflection and we're going to be able to break the light. Remember, in cases that we do in monolithic restorations, we technically trying to break the light to texture, to waves that create the behavior to don't be a flat line. Of course, it's limitation when we work in micro lens. That's the technique that I showed previously. We always going to have limitation in how much we can create those depressions. By looking for the 12 o'clock again, now we can see how these lovel areas, it will have that the light, it will sink in, creating a morphological change that after we finish the product, it's going to be a full behavior of the light conditions. Here with the unilateral light, we can see how that light start becoming broken in parts, and how that is going to increase or reduce the surface of the reflection of the tooth. That is where we're going to focus in these techniques. This is the effect after that we finish this primary texture. We're trying to develop a little bit of some parikimata, there's some little striations into the enamel that technically follow these patterns, and then into the interproximal areas, they will have the behavior to be opposite, because we want to be able to create contrast to the light. So we want that every time after that we glaze this restoration, that part of this texture, it will be blockish, because the glazed ceramics, it will try to saturate this, what it will help us to make that is not gonna look like a balloon. We will break the light through this little striation and proper defined contours of the line angles to start making the restoration to be more alike. And you can see how subtle is this micro parikimata. Now, we do parikimata in 2 stages. This is the first one, because when we connecting the surfaces, we don't want to be so symmetric. So that's why we use the tip of the burr rounded to be able to break those micro lines. Then we come with a next level of anatomical striations. And now we're gonna define some micro groups that we're gonna be doing in some specific areas, because everything again that we want to create is some contrast into the way that we engrave these restorations to create a different light behavior that after it would make the restoration to be a little more natural. This is the effects with the unilateral light, so we can see a little more those depth cuts and how irregular and how we just following patterns, but we're not being symmetrical. We're trying just to follow behaviors for the light after the restorations are glazed. And of course, we need to think in function because the teeth over time, they have the tendency that with the lip movement as we speak and talk and function, is part of that lip that we will polish little by little some of the more volume areas, the high contours, the line angles, the high contour of the tooth, and how those striations can be little by little being more smooth and start to create restoration that they will look more alike. So that's why understand function is important, because even for the technical standpoint, has a huge value in the way that we're going to manipulate our restorations. Now, a lot of people these days trying to do incisal edges that they really square and unnatural. And unfortunately, many of the patients, this is what they asking for, but it's different ways to try to create a straight teeth or some corners or transitions, as I call it, to be able to have a more dominant effect. And that's what I do here with the wheel, to create those areas of wear and tear that we know by function that this is the area that the mandible, we will hammer the maxilla and grind those teeth in some specific areas that will create those digital prints that they totally exclusive for every single patient. And we can end up with contours that now they have the total capability to be stain and glaze. Now, it's important when we do these textures to understand that if you use the improper technique to stain and glaze these restorations, you're going to have an oversaturation of the pigments into these textural groups, what is going to make not appealing or not attractive the restorations. So that's why it's really important to know the different techniques and combinations, procedures, materials, and the mixtures that we do when we're going to do a stain and glaze techniques. We need to understand that we can have stains that they don't have any volume, but we have stains that we can add some particles in ceramic that is going to create a little more volume and thickness that eventually we will diffuse the ceramic. But at the same time, that can be limited sometimes for these techniques because it will have the tendency to sink in these little grooves, making an effect that is undesirable. So here we see the case technically ready to be a stain and glaze. And now in this case, we did the crystallization. But here you can see how these micro points are adding. This is one of the techniques that I'm going to be showing that is called Pointillism, that is a really minimal effects into some specific areas just to catch the attention of the eye and create a beautiful restoration with a less amount of space used. Now, when we have a little more space, or with our customer or patient, because we personally we have different lines of products that we offer to our patients, it's impossible to charge the patients and the technicians. It's impossible to charge the same to the dentist for restorations that they fully crafted by hand and restorations that they barely has been worked, right? So that's why we create value for our patients to understand that it's really important that the patient and everybody has value for what we use, for the time that we put into the restoration. So I developed this technique that I call enhanced cutback. And enhanced cutback, and again, this technique was way before, years ago, before. Now many of the software has some techniques and cutback, but I'm going to explain you why and how I do it and what is my approach with this technique. Technically, we're going to have some interproximal areas of reduction where we're going to put some opalescent materials that, as we know, opalescent materials have that beautiful property to be able to change chroma for the bluish to the oranges, depends how the light is heated. And the value to have opalescent materials in a flat surface is limited because we don't have a window to have the penetration of the light to create that polychromatic bouncing of light. That is what create the effect of, and technically we losing the properties of the material. So those little corners that we create, those depressions, they're gonna be manipulated to be able to put the opalescent materials. And then in that little scoop, or that little spoon that we created a little plateau when slightly we can sink some micro effects to after be micro cover with some basic powders and ceramics. I can do my master ceramic cases for my VIP patients, let's say with a feldspathic ceramics or a full stratifications, technically taking advantage of the contacts layers, but into the end having technically 20 powders and fully multiple layers that can be done in one bake, as I learned with non-dust, or we can do different bakes depending on the strategy that you have and the space and the effects that you want to create. And that's what is really important, this internal layer, as you can see in the black and white picture, how the thinness of the material, it creates more translucency by itself because the material is thin. So we're gonna have a more capability of the light to pass through. And if we enhance that with some micropigments that have the potential to create a layer of absorption, we're definitely going to be able to create a plateau that is validating the substrate where we're going to play the micro effects. And then that time comes. We have here the opalescent powders into those corners and a little enamel material into the incisal ledge that can be spread, keeping the contours of the CAD-CAM restorations and be enhanced by some contrast into the halo that it will be a ceramic that will be a little more opaque to create that combination being minima invasive layering, as I call, and trying to put a little less time to be able to create a restoration that at the end, it will have a really good internal characterization and create some depth. So that's why my internal restorations is something that I've been calling the ink. And this is how I present it to our patients. The ink restorations, patients are aware that they can manufacture. Some of them can be pressed really minimal thickness, but that we're gonna characterize these ceramics with minimal stain techniques. And this is when we really need to understand the properties of the stains. We have the capabilities to have stain techniques that they mix in the powder only with liquid, what is going to create a flat effect. It's going to be chromatic, but it's not going to have volume. But sometimes we cannot have volume because in some of these micro veneers, we do an internal stain and glaze technique for the inner side, in the inner part of the veneer, for instance, that we can have more chromatic coming, or eventually some highlights in as few areas that we painted carefully, utilizing the less amount of space because we're diluting these powders with liquids that they really fluid and they don't having too much substrate to create a volume that is gonna impinge the proper fitting. Of course, every case, the more ideal thing is the planning. So when you plan, you have the capabilities into the CAD-CAM system to create a minimal additional more space for the restorations that you're willing to carry on internally, some micro effects for the restoration. But now we have in the opposite side the capabilities to mix these chromatic particles and embed them into a glaze layer that technically is a low fuse ceramic that mix it with agent that is more thick. It will create some volume. And when we have this volume, we can have those particles to be more spread apart and create chroma and have the beauty to don't blockage the light. And that's the new tendency that all the companies are creating this time, to try to make materials that they premix with low fusing ceramics with a small amount of particles inside to don't block the light and have a more three-dimensional effect, a more reflection and absorption of the light, and take out all these particles that we put underneath to be able to create the chromatic effects. So tattoos is the best way to understand that you can emulate nature, or you can emulate something with a three-dimensional characteristics. Depends in the way that you made the tattoo, or the way, the technique that you use. It's not always color. Most of the time is how you create that internal canvas to be able to create some shadows or contrast that create volumetric effects that we interpreted as natural. The different type of canvas, I call it to the materials that we're gonna use. And it's really important to understand that every material also has chroma as they have translucency. So when we're working in the anterior segment, it's different tricks and pearls that we can use. This case, I did it more than 10 years ago when I tried to emulate the brightness of the anterior teeth, trying to make a different choice into the color that I mill the restorations. So for instance, the anterior teeth, they were mill B1, the laterals were mill A1, canines A2, and then premolars A1 to create that internal chromatic layer. And then we stain that with the color that we want to end up the restoration. So we were taking the inner substructure to carry on as a canvas those effects that it will make the restorations to have more dynamics. One of the most unlike situations is when we have this teeth that they looks like a piano, because the chromatic layers has not taken as a consideration, not taking consideration corners of deep contrast, is not taking a consideration areas of more translucency, and also the density of the dentin and the thickness of the dentin. And that's why canines have the tendency to be a little more warm, because more amount of dentin that we have. So here the combination, or you can see that only with black and white pictures, you can really see as much as the different it is. But in general, you can see how it's a natural blending that technically emulates pretty much the lower dentition that has similar bouncing effects into the reflex of what you're going to use as a material, as substructure. So this is one of the concepts that I handle when I do CAD-CAM, is try to work in different materials and different colors to be able to have a different brightness coming from the inside out. So that's why I create the concept that I call it from value to chroma, where technically we mill in the restorations, and with the stain techniques, we bring in them to a color that unifying them to make it harmonic. And as you can see, the right and the left side, they don't make it exactly in the same materials, having as a consideration that the central laterals and canines that's being used in different ingots or different blocks, and then the stain utilizing thick power thickness, it will allow us to have natural blending. Here, one side is finished, the other side is only with liquid glaze, so you can see the color bouncing and how those internal properties of the ingot, of the block that you choose, is what is going to create the main foundation to carry on the effects that only is going to help to characterize the last part of the restoration. Here you can see the restorations through cross polarization and also to direct light without filters. How is that effect and how the color blends pretty nice, even though that has been manufactured under different conditions. How we have a natural blending into those restorations. So here we come the first case, an anterior matching case. Always make matching cases into the anterior segment is a challenge. And for those that we've been doing CAD-CAM dentistry for many years, we know that sometimes is really a pain to figure it out where you're going to be your start point. So my main advice always is you need to start for a more saturated surface that allows that when you're going to do a matching, you're going to have more freedom to be able not only to cover that internal substrate that is influencing the final outcome of the restoration, but also to be able to be manipulated through the stain techniques that, as I tell you, it will create particles into the surface that it will create a different light absorption. So this was the first attempt, just made it through the initial photos, but technically you see that we have too much brightness and pretty much we didn't match nothing here, and nothing more frustrating that anterior matching that you have to do it again and again and again. So here you can see how the color in the internal substrate is really different than the outside layer. And we need to be able to have two capabilities. One is to be able to cover the inner surface, but the other one is to be able to emulate the translucency that the other teeth has. So we were able to use different effects in stain and glaze. This is a totally monolithic restoration, utilizing different glaze stains and some micro techniques to emulate those little effects. And pretty much, I think we try to get it really similar for where we start. The patient acceptance at the end is always the green light to keep moving, and the patient was totally satisfied. But we always challenging and seeing what we did, how we did it, and how is the interpretation of that color layer after that we do black and white, and we can notice where we put the effects and how those effects create the trick to create an harmonic result. Here you can see all the change to different chromatic values and hues modifying the photography, and that's how you can compare what you did, and of course criticize yourself if you want to do it better next time. Is always a space for improvement. Here is the polarized picture. We can see that I have to use a lot of different stains to make a good combination of translucency and chroma. But pretty much, I think on the different angles, we were able to match that case. Now, the other technique that I quickly gonna talk about it is gonna be the Pointillism. Pointillism is a technique that has been described in art and in tattoos, and every painter knows that this is the combination of little tiny micro tiny pieces that putting together, it will create forms and define effects that we want to look. So here, this is a case minimal invasive, and you can see those micro tiny points that technically are using doing nothing, but they do it. If you see the effects, they run. Unfortunately, they need to try to be as minimal as possible because we don't want to see the effects. We want to see the consequences, what those effects create, mostly into the corners or those little tiny points that when you put these restorations into the mount, you're gonna see how beautiful it will blend with the rest of the other rest of the restoration. You see how minimal are those little tiny points that can be done into multiple layer, multiple firings, or in one bake. It depends of the effect that you're doing. Personally, for pointillism, I try to do multiple bakes because I don't want the mix between those little points, because we're trying to create areas of absorption and deflection of light, and we want to be really micrometric, that when you go deeper and deeper, you barely see those micro points that you create. And these are minimal invasive cases that pretty much the substrate is coming from the inside, and is a minimal enhancement what we're doing with aesthetics. Now, what is important to be able to do is form and be able to manage this for the dentists. I mean, technicians, we live for work into this, but how dentistry has been getting so much amazing these days that we have a huge amount of dentists that they want to involve into the procedures of generation of the restoration. So we have this patient here with a PFA crown in number 9, and we initially made these restorations in enamic, pretty much really thin, paper thin, I will say, utilizing the skin and glue technique. And then when we finished the restorations, patient was pleasing. But then always, it's always an overthinking process. And even though that we do temporaries, in some point the patient decide that the restoration looks a little too long in her face, and she asks us to make an internal recording. So here we can see how we start grinding those restorations to define the line angles, to make exactly the same technique that I showed previously into the models, and how we can create protocols that can be scalable, that we can follow some lines that we can definitely be able to create those minimal striations and micro details and be able to reshape and resurface all the restorations. And this is one of the beautiful things that I like the most about enamic material, that we always have the capability to make modifications in those veneers to be able to have beautiful results and have patients that they totally proud of. So we have a beautiful patient, totally happy with the transformation of the smile and how the light plays a big role in these monolithic restorations to be able to create this breakage of light. That is what it makes these restorations minimal invasive, capable to carry on different effects. For instance, here is a patient that this is the workflow process that we did, some gingival recontouring, temporalization to analyze what is going to be the crown, the length of the crown. And for one picture to the other one is the preparation. So as you can see, it's no preparations because we using this technique that is not a termination line. What you see into the depth is the core that is packed, and then technically we insert in these restorations and they can technically blend. You can see those micro points and how we also can create beautiful experiences. So here, we have a full mount rehabilitation that we did in like 4 stage, utilizing CAD-CAM blocks, enamic into the posterior segment and into the segment, into anterior segment, VITA Forte, Trilus Forte. And then he's a patient with a lot of abrasion, I call it, let's say, where all the lingual parts has been eaten by the acid, and how we have the gax reflex that is making this patient that necessarily need to have a full mouth rehabilitation just because the excess of sensitivity. And then when you see this teeth and you see if you're willing to prep for full crowns, that's why with my clinical team, we took the decision with Dr. Montoya to be able to make lingual veneers for the anteriors and then crowns into the posteriors to be able to cover all those areas that we have all this acidic recession all over. And into the anteriors to be able to be conservative and make restorations facially. So this is the initial prototype that we did to know if the patient liked the proposal of what's going to be the restoration. Of course, a change into the occlusion will be implied. And we have a full digital workflow. So having the alternatives to change the bite position and be able to take advantage of technology to create guides to guide the clinical doctors to be able to prep accordingly to the space that we need, I think is one of the most successful workflows. And the power of the workflows is based in that communication between the patient, the technician, and the dentist to be able to create beautiful experience and beautiful cases as we did. So this is the guides of the preparation. This was the lingual veneers. As you can see, is minimal tiny bit chamfers into the back part only to blockage the lingual areas and crown restorations into the posterior areas. And then we pick the color and you can see how we develop all the posterior crowns and the lingual restorations in enamic that we cemented, and we be able to make it into different steps. And then after, we can definitely put another mock-up on top of it and make a deep cup technique to micro create these beautiful tiny margins that of course can be done only with the utilization of microscope if you really want to see what is underneath. And as you can see, this is really minor preparations. The fact that we're using a lingual veneers is just helping the patient to don't have to have an excessive amount of restoration or preparation to create crowns, to have the lingual and the facial surface to be covered and protected. You can see the thinness of these restorations. You can see for facial how the bluish shows through that it is always going to be a big big influence into the internal colors of the tooth, and how we can definitely create beautiful restorations that the patient will love, that you're going to be satisfied, that you're going to create the physiological aspect to restore the bite and restore the physiology, to be able to capable to change that muscular activity that is changing the face of the patient, and at the end it's just creating a beautiful restoration. So unfortunately the time today was not as much, so I will be able to make you a hands-on in another opportunity. I really want to thank you guys to be here today, and thank VITA for this opportunity to have me here, sharing a little bit about the passion that I have for dentistry. I have multiple things prepared for you guys, different tryings, materials, different cases that I show into the lecture, that you can see the materials, but really important, these micro veneers and the utilization of all the products that VITA has. We customizing the stumps, that is really important step, to be able to customize the models. Now we can print flexera material, give us a beautiful pink color that we can make the stumps and be able to create that inner influence into the color for these restorations that we will do. So anyways, this was a little bit about what I was planning to show you into the demo, but if you like it and you put your comments over here and you register for future events, I'm gonna be so happy to share my passion for dentistry. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for being here.
All right, so Javier, I'm going to help finish this out. So thank you very much for a lot of wealth of information. I'm sure the audience has really been helped with your step-by-step. I really liked how you went step-by-step process and so forth. I will just kind of close out with a few things here. So CE, anybody's asking for CE, that will be automatically sent to you through our education department. If you don't see something next couple days, just email our education department and we'll get that letter to you, or the type of CE. We will use your registration as that information. Today's webinar has been recorded, so go ahead and visit our websites to see that. Give us a couple days. We have also going to post it on social media, YouTube, LinkedIn, and so forth. If you need to get a hold of any of your local reps, or here in the U.S. or in Canada, there is some information here. We do have some future workshops, and we'll see if Dr. Vasquez would like to join us again in the future, maybe just to do a just strictly hands-on remote program. And you can also see Dr. Vasquez. I hope I'm not ahead of the game, Javier, but maybe at Dentsply Sirona World, DS World. He'll be there, and we'll be doing some hands-on there with him and some lecturing as well, so you'll be able to visit him and talk to him directly then. But in the meantime, also the rest of this year, we have many remote workshops, webinars going on. If you need to get a hold of the VITA Help Desk, Paul or myself will be happy to help you out and get you over to Dr. Vasquez as needed. And it looks like the picture didn't show correctly, but Here is Dr. Vasquez's information. So Dr. Vasquez is gracious enough to let us post his contact information. So give him, if you do email him or call him, give him some time to respond. He is a very, very busy, active technician and doctor, working all types of hours and so forth. So please give him time to respond. Now, as far as some questions, Javier, if you're ready, we'll go through some of the questions that we have.
Go ahead.
And then we'll wrap this up. So let's see here. Is the purpose of the blue color material under the veneer to to monitor the thickness, or does it have another purpose? I think it's to show two things. You had blue to show the translucency, what's going to bleed through, and then you had the colored pencils where you want to adjust the restorations. But
correct. The blue is definitely to be able to show the thickness in the restoration, to be able to grind it by hand, so you can go as thin as possible without the perforation.
And let's see, question is, do you have any specialized burrs that you use that you recommend?
Yeah, what you see into the video technically is what I use. I use a lot of the MPF product, but also Harvest Dental products that they have these stones in the shapes that I show. Always some point Brasler burrs or Premier. Technically, it's those shapes that I show into the video exactly what is my armamentarium when we're doing texture. And this is how we apply in all the clinical courses. We need to keep it simple sometimes. It's not the tools what you make the sculpture. I think it's the knowledge of what you want to sculpt.
Another follow-up to that was actually the wheel, the rubber wheel that you used to kind of pre-polish. Is that a special type? Is it just a diamond impregnated wheel?
Yeah, it's the cheapest one in the market for sure. It will be abrasive for these CAD-CAM materials, and of course, it made the job to try to reduce the texture that we create. So we need to be into the stronger side.
All right, and then your inside-out concept. You did a lot of photography. The question's always, what type of camera do you use? What's your setting? I know that's a whole nother presentation, but it's always a question we have when we have great photography.
Photography is about the light, so the settings normally depend on the camera that you're using. If you work in a full frame or any other DSL camera, technically I work with a small aperture, like about 32, 25 to 32, 200 or 100 ASO, because depending of the sensor that you're using, and technically everything goes to 125, and it's only the intensity of the flashes that we work. But technically here in my office, everybody is able to take the same photography I do, just because it's a standard. I'm gonna have a course in October, photography with Milos from Romania. If somebody in the group is interested, this is how I learn. I learn my mentors. I'm just the recopilation of passion to learn for a lot of good friends, and my passion for teaching, that I want to make everybody to know the same. So everything that I know, we're able to continue teaching it. So it's not as simple. It's just to have a little taste for photography, but it's not difficult to get this kind of photography.
Do you find future to have mirrorless cameras, the ones that are now coming out on the market, the ones without the mirrors, or are you familiar with those at all?
Not at all.
Yeah. All right. It was just a question. I think, there's people in our industry now, the transition is maybe to start with mirrorless cameras, and we often get questions about that as well.
I think the light is what is going to domain any technology. It's all the lighting. You can dim it out or put it into wherever you want to use the light, but it's all about the light, because the camera always can be adjusted.
How thin can you mill out your veneer?
Excuse me?
How thin, the thickness, how thin
Oh,
can
it
you
can,
mill your veneers?
okay, normally we mill it to 500 microns, that is zero 0.5, like that's the beginning. Depending the material, if I'm doing an amic, I can go to 300, that is zero 0.3, because the properties of an amic, it make it that doesn't break, and you can really thin it out into the milling process. But when you're doing feldspathic, like you know, any other kind, I will definitely make it thicker, even if I press or mill and I thin it out by hand. That's what is really important, to be able to be capable to resemble the texture and the line angles and contours to keep the design that you want.
And this question, I'm sure it's case dependent, but do you have a preference to mill a veneer, press a veneer, or traditional foil slash wedger refractory type veneer?
I will say that is more about what the patient can pay for it. I mean, like I did a veneer case in my wife, and I decided to do platinum foil because I can put the time to do it. That's how we wanted to do. Um, Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time and they break a lot, so you need to charge more. So if you're getting
Yeah.
paid for that, that can be it. Also, occlusion is important. So if was a patient, it's a patient that has occlusion problem, definitely I wouldn't use those materials. I definitely would try to use something stronger that can be performed better.
Yeah, and platinum foil, it's a technique being lost in our field in dentistry on the technical side,
Oh, but
unfortunately.
it is beautiful. But you know, I mean, when we have the new materials today, like Trilux Forte, that is a feldspathic material, you can mill it and have a multi-layer effect. Is that you need to use different wheels to thin it out. Like in the silica, I can go with wheels, but if I gonna do with Trilux, I gonna go definitely go by really fine diamonds, because I would need to be able to take the dust and the particles out, because the geometry of the particles of the material, it make it different. It's less organized like the silicon material. So that's what is important, to understand the instruments that you're using according to the material that you're going to carve.
All right, yeah, it makes sense. So this is another question. Your cases that you showed your crowns on the model, is there a particular material you use to retain the crown or the veneers on the model so they don't fall off as you work? Do you just use Vaseline? Is there a specialized material?
No, I glue them. So I use paper
Oh,
glue,
glue them?
and I really want those restorations to be bonded, because it's like a glass. If you have a glass in the air, it can break like a window. But if you have that glass on top of a flat surface and you have some sort of liquid between, the superficial tension is totally saturated and it will increase the strength. So the trick for the restorations is always glue them to the stumps, and then you can get to finish. And independent of the thickness, if the restoration is thick, I will glue them with the glue that they like paper bars, you know, these ones that they dry less. But if I want to really thin, I want to really be sure that I glue them all the way. And if I working in printable models, I use crazy glue, because I want the restoration to totally glue to that. And then always is the chance that put it in water with a steamer, they will detach, and then you can micro sandblast it.
All right. Good to know. So here's another one of our last questions. The digital software that you showed, you had like a mini movie, or it rotated that digital software. What was the name of that software you used in those
It's called
little
Nemo.
small short movie?
Yeah, that is called Nemo Studio. Nemo Studio is a suite of different software that has a smile design, implants, orthopedics, orthodontics, and maxillofacial surgery. and I have the opportunity to be developing the smile design. So I design all these automatic guides for preparation to be able to make a mock-up and automatically generate all these guides for the doctors to be able to control the amount of restoration, the preparation.
All right. So, Dr. Vasquez, any last comments you'd like to share with the audience before we end today's webinar?
I mean, I don't know, just do everything with passion. That's what I will say, because that shows it's important to educate the patients. It's a lot of fake smiles around there. And I'm concerned about my daughter generation, because from that time, my daughter is 8 years of age, and I'm thinking, if we go into this level of fakeness in everything that is happening and big time in dentistry, is going to be incredible, catastrophic, we'll say. So I think it's important to guide the patient, to coach them, to create value for nature, to try to stay into harmonic smile designs with basic color and proper choice of the materials, but always try to guide the patient for the best decision to be able to keep generations of smiles that they're still looking natural.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate, again, your time and your effort. It was great information. I think the audience is very pleased with the amount of detail that you put into your dentistry. And it's something that we can all try to, look forward to achieve in ourselves. And, really appreciate your strong emphasis of education and train other people to show them your techniques, as opposed to just showing a picture and not telling them how you achieved it. So I think the education component is excellent, and I appreciate everything you've done in today's webinar and talked about.
My pleasure. We're bigger when we're together. So
all right, that's excellent. I like that.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I'd also go ahead. I'm sorry.
And thank you for the audience to spend this time with us, listen a little bit of what we have to share. Thank you, all of you guys, to be here. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, the audience, those of you that are attending. Appreciate your spending some time on this webinar and listening to Dr. Javier Vasquez this last hour. And we hope to see you again on another webinar. Today, this will end the remote webinar with Dr. Javier Vasquez. See you at another time.
Thank you so much.